Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Well, last Saturday, a group of us from St. Mary's participated in the 60th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington. A peaceful, multiracial, interfaith, and multi-ethnic multitude attended. One man, Denorva Garrett Jr., carried an 80-pound wooden cross he had made to call attention to gun victims, and he invited people to sign it. I must confess to being a little scared in going to this march that some hate-filled domestic terrorist would attack this important 60th anniversary march. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And yet, the very next day, a hate-filled white young extremist radicalized on social media murdered 3 black people at a Dollar General in Jackson, Florida, on the 5th anniversary of another mass shooting in that city. In 2022, the Anti-Defamation League cited 6,000 examples of white supremacist activity. And so far, just this year, there have been 470 mass shootings. There is way too much hatred and violence in this country. Well, in our gospel reading of Matthew 16, 2,000 plus years ago, Jesus prepares his disciples to face the same hatred and violence that he endured in the scary world of Roman occupation. Jesus warns that suffering and murder await him in Jerusalem, plotted by the jealous religious leaders and carried out by the Roman oppressors. Matthew's own community knows that some have been martyred for their faith. If anyone wants to follow Jesus, they must carry their own cross. Peter, who was praised for his confession in Jesus last week, he said that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. And Jesus says he is the rock on which Christ will build his church. But this same rock now, paradoxically, is rebuked instead as Satan's stumbling block. You see, God's kingdom of love will not be based on lies, manipulation, hatred, and cursing of one's enemies, but instead on the truth, on love and blessing for those who hate us, modeled by Jesus on the cross, publicly reigning for all to see, for all time. And here, in excruciating suffering, Jesus unites people of all races, genders, and nations forever, east and west, north and south. Well, Jesus promises suffering if we love God and our neighbor as ourselves in this world of opposition and hatred. And that is a truly challenging message, I find. So how then are we to respond when others hurt and hate us? Jeremiah the prophet attests in the Old Testament reading how painful it is to speak truth to power, to live a life of self-giving, integrity, and faithfulness. Well, Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 12, verses 9 to 21, answers in detail how we are to respond when faced with intimidation and attacks, both verbal and physical, emotional and spiritual. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King lived what Paul wrote: non-violent protest in the face of threats of lynching, imprisonment for marching for racial and economic equality, for jobs and freedom for all. Like Jesus, the Apostle Paul, the Reverend Dr. King, and Congressman Lewis, when cursed, they blessed. When punched, whipped, trampled on, they continued marching and speaking out. And when white clergy counseled passive patience, King challenged them and challenges us today in the Episcopal Church to live up to God's standards of active love for everyone, which crosses religion, nationality, and all denominations. So Paul challenges the Roman Christians to let love be genuine, both within the congregation and outside in their relationships out in the world with those who differ from them. Paul says that we must hate evil, not hate people. Reject the evil lies that some human beings are inferior. We must hate Satan's strategies of divide and conquer in politics and religion. And we must share our wealth and speak out against the unfair distribution of riches that go to the 1%, while 99% suffer want. Paul does not condone or passively accept wrong behavior. But hating our enemies actually harms us. Doesn't hurt them. Anne Lamott, in her book Traveling Mercies, graphically describes the effects on our hearts, minds, and bodies of not forgiving, which is hating. She says it's like us drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. In chapter 5 of her book, Almost Everything, Notes on Hope, she confesses with humor and insight her own personal struggles with hatred, which we all feel, right? And as the psalmist also attests. She writes, hate is both comforting and malignant. We become fused with people when we hate them. No longer ourselves, we become like them. I can't change them. So I pray, bless them with nice retirement opportunities, Lord. But while you're at it, help them not to blow up the entire world. Thanks. No one can take the hatred off me. I have to surrender it every time I become aware of it. Hate weighed me down and muddled my thinking. It isolated me and caused my shoulders to hunch. I don't want my life's ending to be that I was toxic and self-righteous. So instead, she urges us to square our shoulders and lift our gaze, to look up and out and focus on joy instead. Howard Thurman, in his classic Jesus and the Disinherited, writes that Jesus rejected hatred because he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit, death to communion with his Father. And Jesus affirmed life. Genuine love means forgiving the hurts that we all, right? We all knowingly and also unknowingly afflict on one another in the church, which is filled with imperfect people like ourselves. Genuine love means blessing and not cursing, overcoming evil with good and leaving judgment to God, who will finally at the end of time send his Son back to earth to repay us for all that we have done. I was moved by a Washington Post story, perhaps you read it, of how a Muslim congregation welcomed a stranger who was raised to hate Muslims and who went to their mosque with the intention of bombing it. Richard McKinney was treated with such kindness and compassion that day that he changed his mind. And when months later, integrated into the mosque, he was confronted about his evil plot, he was given and he received their forgiveness. And this is incredible. He was so touched that he even became the mosque's president. Wow. So I wonder, where is there hatred, bitterness, and resentment stored in the depths of our own hearts and minds? How can we begin to open our tightly clenched fists and allow God to pour God's healing and liberating love into our bodies, minds, and spirits? We need one another's help to let go and let God. And that's one reason why we come together weekly for worship, to receive God's forgiveness and to encourage one another to have a new start. I invite you to make an appointment with your clergy to share any specific experiences that you may need help with. So let's live and march peaceably together for loving justice and a fair distribution of wealth, for truthful and inclusive values of equality and siblinghood, just as we did in DC last Saturday. Amen.